Yeah, New Zealand. Such an incredibly beautiful paradise filled with sheep, stunning natural beauty, an incredible culture, more sheep, a very well-developed economy with an exceptionally high standard of living, even more sheep, and probably the best place on the planet to build a doomsday bunker to save yourself and your family from the inevitability of a nuclear war. Oh, did I mention that the nation also happens to have loads of sheep? In all seriousness, the economic achievements of New Zealand are nothing short of a miracle. The island is in the middle of nowhere. It has nothing valuable to offer to the world except some low-margin agricultural products, and China has over 60 cities, counted by municipalities, with a population higher than the entirety of the nation. In fact, the nation is so small and irrelevant that people literally forget to put them in world maps, and most people call the continent, which they are a part of, Australia, instead of Oceania, as if they don't even exist. But despite all that, this little obscure part of the globe somehow has managed to be the physical manifestation of paradise. It has some of the highest standards of living on Earth, a really decently sized economy, a booming tourism sector, and some of the happiest citizens on the planet. But recently, there appears to be some trouble in paradise, from young people leaving the nation for better opportunities abroad to a housing crisis, rapidly increasing government debt, and New Zealand being unable to shake its over-reliance in old, outdated industries like farming, means that maybe the perfect economy isn't so perfect after all. So in this video, let's go over three things. How did New Zealand manage to get so unimaginably wealthy, especially after their economy basically flopped worse than the 8th season of Game of Thrones in the 70s and 80s? Why is the growth suddenly slowing down nowadays? And most importantly, what can Australia's little brother do to save itself from a very dark and uncertain future? But let's begin with the start. How did New Zealand even become a rich nation? You might expect a story similar to that of Germany or Japan, war-torn, impoverished nations that created massive cutting-edge mega companies that revolutionized highly sophisticated technological fields and pushed forward the boundaries of what's possible. But in reality, the story was much less interesting than that, and most of the pre-1974 economy was basically revolving around one single thing: raise livestock and then sell it to the British. That accounted for over 90% of all their exports, and while it wasn't anything flashy or groundbreaking, that shit printed them some crazy money, which allowed the nation to be inside the global top 10, and its citizens enjoyed an exceptionally high quality of life. Well, until 1973 at least. The following year, the United Kingdom joined the European Union, and with that came the realization that the people of Britain were actively being ripped off by Kiwi farmers who overcharged them for low-quality agricultural goods. Obviously, this was devastating for the economy of New Zealand, and if you also account for an oil price boom and that their Prime Minister kept treating the national budget as his personal casino bankroll, it should come to you as no surprise that the nation by 1984 was broke and drowning in debt. And here is when the hero of our story comes in: Roger Douglas. Many people love him and many hate him, but one thing is certain: he had some balls. What you need to understand about New Zealand before 1984 is that the government basically micromanaged every single part of the economy, from wages to prices, interest rates, and most importantly, subsidies for farmers. Roger knew very well that this couldn't go on forever, and sooner or later the nation would simply run out of money. So he did something very risky and dangerous. Overnight, he removed almost all subsidies, he sold off public companies, allowed the free market to do basically whatever it wanted to do, and he put an end to the fixed price of the nation's currency. And the results were very clear and undeniable. The nation crashed. The economy suffered, unemployment skyrocketed, many people suddenly found themselves without a roof over their heads, and a large share of the nation's businesses, especially farmers, suddenly went bankrupt. But Roger wasn't an idiot. He understood the risks very well, and he knew that at least in the short term he would be very unpopular, and many people would suffer. It got so bad for him that he even had a falling out with his Prime Minister due to his policies being way too extreme, and he even resigned from his position 2 different times due to internal conflicts. But luckily for him and the rest of New Zealand, he was right. The policies after a few years started working out. The government, after laying off thousands of low productivity employees, finally managed to run a budget surplus. The few farmers that did survive ended up being much more competitive, and the agricultural sector actually ended up growing after he removed the subsidies. The nation started running massive marketing campaigns that grew the tourism sector and made products made in New Zealand much more appealing for international buyers. And most importantly, the nation started diversifying its economy, both in terms of industries, but also in terms of who they do business with. Instead of the UK taking up 90% of their exports, nowadays they have a much more healthy spread, with the USA, the Netherlands, Japan, Singapore being large trade partners for them. Although in recent years, a massive dependence on the Chinese economy has been growing, but we are going to talk about that later in the video. Overall speaking, this was nothing short of an economic miracle, and Roger, despite his harsh and ruthless methods, is still remembered as the father of the modern economy of New Zealand, and all the governments that came after him have followed in his footsteps. But while the economic boom was impressive, it didn't last forever. In recent years, it has become very clear that the nation is struggling with a multitude of issues, and this time they might be actually cooked. Let's start by taking a look at the nation's GDP per capita. While it's still well above the world average, and New Zealand is definitely a very well-developed and wealthy nation, we do have to acknowledge a very obvious fact, and that's that the nation has been falling behind its peers like the USA, Germany, Canada, and most importantly, Australia. And the reasons behind it are quite complex. It's facing many of the typical problems developed economies are facing in the rest of the world, like an aging population, an overvalued real estate sector, a fragmented political scene, and quickly deteriorating infrastructure. But in New Zealand's case, one main issue seems to be the main driver behind the nation's recent troubles, and that's its relationship with Australia. The two nations are basically twins. They speak the same language, have very similar cultures, both are former British colonies, and because of free trade agreements, similar to those in Europe, a huge amount of people have migrated from one side to the other over the years. Such a relationship can obviously be very beneficial for both sides. It increases tourism, international ties, skilled workers can find better opportunities abroad, and so on. But in New Zealand's case, it might actually be a net negative, and that's for a very simple reason. Australia is a global superpower that's home to international mega corporations and a humongous economy. On the other hand, New Zealand at the end of the day is a glorified sheep farm, which means that whenever we speak of skilled workers moving abroad for better opportunities, 9 times out of 10, we mean moving from New Zealand to Australia. The brutal truth is that moving to Australia will typically increase your salary by 30 to 40%, and New Zealand is simply unable to compete with that. While 70,000 Australians are currently living in New Zealand, mainly retirees, over 700,000 Kiwis are living in Australia, with most of them being young, highly educated professionals, and that ends up creating a negative feedback loop. The young and educated leave the nation, which means less profitable companies get created, and then because of that, salaries decrease, which mean that even more young people end up leaving the nation. So now that we have established that the nation has found itself in an incredibly bad position, and there is no easy way out, it's time to ask ourselves the important question: can they do anything to save themselves? Probably no. There have been some desperate attempts, but very little results have been achieved. For example, to fix the nation's unimaginably high home prices, they decided to ban foreign citizens from purchasing homes. Whenever they are implemented, generally speaking, such policies tend to have mixed results. So this plan already had very low chances of working out. However, conveniently, the government still allows the citizens of two nations to still buy homes in the country. Firstly, we have Singapore, which is random as fuck. But anyways, and secondly, we have the big bro, Australia, who conveniently already accounted for the overwhelming majority of foreigners buying up houses in New Zealand, and the results are very clear. They did next to nothing to drop down home prices. However, there still exists some light at the end of the tunnel. The nation has an exceptionally good international image and reputation, which means that many foreigners are willing to pay a premium just for a product to be made in New Zealand. Secondly, they need to find ways to attract foreign talent. Building out global cutting-edge companies is the modern fast track to economic success. However, building them out not only requires immense capital and technical know-how, but also a massive population. And unfortunately, New Zealand, with a population of under 6 million, is simply unable to develop them to any meaningful degree. So trying to copy Singapore by being a center of business instead of actually creating those businesses is probably their best bet. And lastly, we have China. The last economic crash that completely devastated the nation was due to immense overdependence on the British. In recent decades, a very similar relationship seems to be growing with China, and New Zealand becomes more and more reliant on China for trade every single day that passes. And while this is an incredible opportunity for them, it comes with many risks, so diversifying their export partners a little more might be a good idea. And while it's true that New Zealand is facing some serious problems, we still have to acknowledge the nation is still in pretty good shape, but the same can't be said about their parent nation, the United Kingdom. If you want to learn more about the problems the UK is facing in recent years and why they probably won't be able to solve them, click here. Anyways, have a great rest of your day.